As is our custom, we're going to move straight into our Green Themes presentation. This evening we have Robert Binder, with Public Engagement Project Manager with Sycamore Consulting. And it looks like the title of the talk is Connecting Meridian Township, Engaging with Transportation and Sustainability. Thank you for coming. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for having me. I'm humbled to be here. So I've just talked through my bio a little bit. I'm a graduate of Michigan State University in the 2013 class. I focus in transportation, but my real passion is city planning, which is really what brings me here. I interned for the Port Authority in New York. I started out working with Kimley Horn for 4 years in consulting. Recently left there to focus more on my master's candidacy at Georgia Tech. I'm working on NASA research, and as you mentioned, I'm a part-time consultant with Sycamore, as well as some freelance work under the name Oxus. But my bicycle planning study abroad that I had this past summer is the reason why Susan invited me here to speak. I want to kind of relate what I learned through that process and really what inspired me to Meridian Township. So, starting out, I want to talk through a metaphor. It's a cliff metaphor. So we have two different cliffs. We have people further back from the edge of the cliff and people close to the edge of the cliff. You can think about this metaphor as problems as well, solving problems. And excuse my poor paint drawing that I did a couple days ago. So this metaphor is usually used in public health and healthcare to speak through that. So one cliff gets an ambulance for people that fall off the cliff, and then the other cliff doesn't. And so you could think of that in terms of inner city folks, poor ambulance response. Then we add some secondary healthcare in, secondary prevention programs. That net for the first cliff has few holes, few people make it through that net. The other cliff has a poor net, a lot more holes, people make it fall through the net. Next solution, primary prevention, add up a wall. Hopefully it just stops people from falling off the cliff altogether. So the way you can think about this for solving environmental problems, transportation problems, is the same. You want to keep people away from getting to the edge of that cliff in the first place. And so what issues can we solve before they make it to the cliff? For example, land use. As I mentioned, my bicycle study abroad over the summer was through the University of Oregon. We biked around Copenhagen, rural areas of Denmark, Sweden, as well as Netherlands. And we focused a lot on sustainability and land use practices as well. So a lot of people don't realize, but Copenhagen, Amsterdam, they're well known as bicycle-friendly cities, multimodal cities, but they also had a car takeover in the 1950s. Up until 1973, when the oil crisis happened, their policies were basically for highway expansion, just like it was here. In Copenhagen, they experienced protests from cyclists, as crazy as that sounds, for them to be able to keep their bicycle culture intact. In Amsterdam, there was a very well-known decision by most residents there, 25 versus 24. 25 were in favor of not building the freeway, 24 were in favor of building it. And that's really what transitioned Amsterdam into becoming the bicycle-friendly city that we know of it as today. The common response between both Copenhagen and Amsterdam and those countries was that they thought about the solutions to these problems outside the box, and they said, what manual? We all know we have the Astro Green Book, we have NACTO for all these different engineering and planning issues, but they realized sometimes there's problems that you can't use a manual to solve, and you need to think outside that box. So in Europe, what do they do right? Infrastructure, sustainability, and they have a mindset and a culture that supports decisions that are for the long-term future. So key takeaway points that I got from my trip and what I think we can bring back and what makes things possible in the US. One is the policies that they put in place over there for transportation and sustainability. They impact a longer-term vision and a cultural shift towards being more sustainable. Two, There's a ton of coordination. It's very clear that there's coordination between all of their agencies and stakeholders. And 3, engaging the public and selling the message is always on their minds for planners and engineers. So, relating to different experiences I had over in Europe, point number 1 in terms of policies equals long-term cultural shift. Traffic gardens. Traffic gardens were built about 50 years back in order to bring students who were in elementary school out and learn how to ride a bike in the road. Iben, who is the woman in the first photo, she is a woman that I met there, and she's about 60 years old. She went to the traffic garden in 5th grade and learned how to ride a bike in the road, learned about traffic laws, as you can see on the right, all the different signage. She was there teaching her grandchildren. So they get them while they're young to get influenced by this culture, this bicycle culture, this culture that you don't need a car to get around. The Supercycle Highways, which is almost a new phenomenon happening in Denmark. They think of it in a regional way. We took the train out about 40 miles outside of Copenhagen, and we decided instead of taking the train back into the city after our meeting, we would bike. On that bike ride back into Copenhagen, we saw 2 folks that were actually in the meeting with us at the regional office on their bikes, and they said, "Oh, you guys are the students." And they were on their commute home back in Copenhagen. Point number 2, as I mentioned, coordination across agencies. Their modes are connected. Their train stations have bicycle rental right underneath the tracks, not outside across the street, like directly underneath. And so it really enhances that experience and pushes more people to use these modes. And point number 3 is engaging the public and selling the message. So one of my first projects with Kimley Horn actually ended up as a failure. I consider it a failure of my own and a failure of my group. And that is a headline from one of the newspapers. 2 city council members question traffic studies used for Peachtree Road Transformation Project. Well, it's not fun when you're the one that did the traffic study. That traffic study was squeaky clean, but we gave them reason to think otherwise. We didn't necessarily sell the message as, this is a safety project, this is an operations project, it's going to make your travel time more consistent. It was sold as a bicycle project in a neighborhood that isn't necessarily bicycle friendly at the moment. So the public immediately saw this as we were taking a lane from them for bicycle, for cyclists, which was not the case. It was to make a safer road. What ended up happening is the project is not going to happen. It continues to be discussed, but it's not happening. Peachtree Road, by the way, is in Atlanta where I live currently. And I relate the issues that happen on this project to the CATA bus rapid transit project in town here. When you look at the way it was messaged to the public, was that the correct way to message it? Did the way that consultants and planners and the municipalities sell it to the public, did that get in the way of them understanding that this is an overall long-term benefit for the community? So why does all these things that I learned in Europe matter to Meridian Township? So let's go back over to Meridian Township. And I want to preface the issues that I'm about to discuss as I didn't do a survey in Meridian Township. These are the issues that I see as having been a student at Michigan State in Meridian Township. So there's rapid growth of auto-oriented development, as you can see right around us. Traffic congestion during the peak periods and lack of coordination with surrounding communities. That lack of coordination with surrounding communities comes from my understanding of how the CATA bus rapid transit project went. And is more so in terms of there's a lot of growth happening in this region, and a lot of it is due to that student population, and how can we look at that growth and take advantage of it instead of, as Meridian Township, instead of putting a wall up to that growth. So going forward, Meridian Township has made some awesome investment in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, better connecting across the community. But are these improvements just nets and temporary fences along the cliff, going back to the cliff metaphor? is there something that we need to look at that can solve these issues of traffic congestion and coordination that's at the top of the cliff? So here's a map of a general stick diagram map of our area around us. And here's developments happening. In East Lansing, you're seeing a lot of growth, and that growth is happening within a pretty dense corridor along the Grand River Avenue corridor. Over in Okemos, Meridian Township, Hazlet area, you're seeing new development, but are those developments being patterned and placed in a way that is not going to blow up our traffic corridor, or is it going to utilize, are these people moving into these new developments going to utilize the transit system that's already in place? So is there a way that we can change policy to impact land use in Meridian Township to better deal with the growth that's occurring in housing? Is there a way that if a new developer comes in and says, I want to build a new housing development, and yes, it's probably going to have students because that's where the growth is there a way we can say, okay, you can do that, but you need to do that along the Grand River Avenue corridor because we're providing transit for that area already. We're not going to get worse traffic congestion from this development because it's along a corridor that we're already investing in its transportation infrastructure. And then once you make those land use decisions, can you better connect it with other modes, such as a bicycle infrastructure network? I really, truly, having been a student at Michigan State, I really, truly feel that connecting to Meridian Township, connecting to East Lansing, connecting all these municipalities in this region is important. And in terms of a regional view, it's going to be better for everybody across the board, as opposed to better for just students, because these are facilities that everybody uses. So again, just recapping the points of looking at changing land use patterns in Meridian Township and utilizing that growth that's going to happen. Refocus growth along Grand River. Utilize existing density, CATA, which is already there, we already pay for it, and the bicycle network that's already in place and continuously expanding. Tell the story to the public in a way that focuses on the short-term gains that they're going to get and also on the long-term gains. And use Michigan State and the growth that's happening in housing in the region to the township's advantage instead of thinking that it's a problem. So there's my contact information. I had to fly through a lot of the information, but please let me know if you have any questions, and yeah, I'm happy to answer some now.
Questions from the commissioners?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you foresee any issues coming up in the next year, 2, 3, based on the growth we've seen so far, that we should particularly pay attention to? Like whether a particular stretch of road or intersection?
I think that the issues are more of a medium to longer term view, in that the decisions we make in land use now is going to cause a growth that could be unsustainable in the future. And if we make decisions now to be smarter, to have a smarter growth and to have a more sustainable future, then it's a longer term fix. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you said there's already been some improvement. Like, can you give some examples of it, just out of curiosity?
For bicycle infrastructure?
Yeah, like what we've seen so far.
I guess I was speaking with Susan yesterday, Hazlet Road and Lake Lansing, so in northern sections of the township, that's my understanding. And actually, about 4 years ago, when I was still a student, our final studio design, I spoke with a few people from the township about building a connection all the way from Lake Lansing down, utilizing the rail corridor down to Michigan State's campus. So, with all the new student housing that's happening over in near Hannah Plaza, near Hannah Plaza, yeah.
So I'm interested that when you're reflecting on your time in Europe, some of your comments had to do with actions that changed the culture. And when you're talking about Meridian Township, what I was hearing was more about planning and incentives for the shorter term projects. So I'm curious what you see as the scope for that longer term culture change in this environment.
Do you mean like a timeline, or
What steps?
how broadly do we need to?
What steps could be taken to make that broader shift towards valuing alternative transportation modes that you witnessed in other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, I think that Meridian Township is, of course, developed from the growth that happened from, from suburbanization, and so it's built in a way that is auto-oriented, of course, and so it's definitely an environment that takes effort to fix. But I think the biggest thing is that land use and catching people while they're young, for example, like the traffic garden, and making people understand that, helping people understand that there are other ways to get around, even in terms of the CATA bus, letting people be aware that the frequency on Grand River is every 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It's pretty easy, and when you're sitting in traffic along Grand River, I actually checked it this morning. I was going to lunch with a few people in Lansing, and I was in East Lansing, and I checked the bus schedule, and it was only a few minutes longer than if I were to drive myself. And so I think that short term, helping people understand that there already is a system in place for these types of modes, and longer term, using land use and growth to impact how that system works in a better way. So.
I have a question about the traffic garden.
Am I on or not? Yeah, sorry. I have a question about the traffic garden. So, first of all, I love the idea.
Yeah.
I was completely unaware of that as a cultural component of anywhere in Europe. But
Yeah, there's actually some that have recently been developed in the U.S. as well. There's one in Seattle, for example.
so, are these things though that are essentially required of children? I mean, do they go and do those things as part of their regular schooling or whatever, so that they're so that essentially all children experience these things? And is there a sort of retroactive training too, or are there traffic gardens for adults, basically? Because to be quite honest, I would, when I ride my bicycle around this township, half of what I feel like I'm doing is training drivers.
Yeah.
No, honestly, and a lot of the drivers have sincerely gotten significantly better in the last decade. I don't know, Bill, do you feel the same way? I would say that the number of obnoxious or, close call type interactions I've had has significantly dropped in the time I've, in relatively recent years. But of course, what would be best would be if there was a much stronger sense of identification between people who are operating in different modes.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to identify with somebody is to have had that experience yourself.
Yeah.
So that's why I like the traffic garden idea.
Yeah, I actually, starting out on my end, is I live in Atlanta, which is very car oriented, but I own a car, and so I bike everywhere, and that is not a fun place to bike ride, and I also feel that same way about teaching drivers. And it was amazing to be over there and be cycling down and across a driveway, for example, and literally not even thinking that it could be a danger to you, as you do here. Every driveway here.
Every driveway, yeah.
In terms of the traffic garden, the one I know about is in Copenhagen, but every single fifth grader in Copenhagen goes to the traffic garden for 2 days in their fifth grade year. So it's part of their curriculum of every student in the city. And like I mentioned, it's been happening for the last 60 years. And they're there to learn how to ride a bike in traffic, not learn how to drive a car, for example. So it's pretty amazing that it's so ingrained in them. In Utrecht, they also have a traffic garden, but they just closed it. Utrecht, Netherlands, they just closed it. Their feeling is it's so ingrained in their culture to ride a bike that they don't need the traffic garden anymore. They put it on the parents to teach. In Copenhagen, they also put it on the parents after that field trip. So that's why that older woman was there with her grandchildren. After that field trip, they continue to take their children to the traffic garden because it's in the middle of a large park. And it almost acts as a playground. I was watching some of the kids riding around, and they weren't following the traffic laws, but being there in that environment makes them think about it when they're that young. And actually, another note is Eugene, Oregon is planning to develop a traffic garden in the next couple of years, and I'm helping them work on that. They're putting in a grant for the next fiscal 5 years to get money towards developing that. So it is happening. One of the reasons why it's happening in Eugene is because the Eugene planners and traffic engineers were on part of our trip with us. And so they saw that awesome environment, and they saw the students, and they saw that BMW had donated all of these small training bikes, for example. And so there's organizations that back this as well. And it's funny that an automotive company donated bikes.
That's great.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
So just a couple of quick notes to wrap up. First, you may not be aware, and people at home may not be aware, that the township recently created a transportation commission.
Awesome.
Which has in its mandate both transit and alternative transportation modes.
That's
and
great.
That's a sign of, in my view, of real progress in this domain. And another note, just from a couple of days ago, there's an article in the current East Lansing Info about the city of East Lansing, which also has a transportation commission, looking at its policies with riding bicycles to school, which at one point historically was forbidden, and that policy was changed, but there's a movement within that community to change the practices, and a lot of that has to do with both making it more safe through infrastructure, making sure that it's safe to get to and from the school on a bike, but also training the kids and the drivers to interact safely. So there are some real signs of change and to be supported, in my view.
Yeah, I think with the outreach component for drivers, that's something that has to happen on more of a, from what I've seen, is something that should happen more on a grassroots level. And so cycling organizations in cities around the country, I feel like that's something they could take on, because it's already a lot for a city to invest in infrastructure, and again for them to teach about the infrastructure as well. So,
Okay, I promise these will be my last comments.
yeah,
There are two pieces of legislation currently pending in the state of Michigan. One would mandate a safe passing law, so it mandates the safe distance to pass a bicycle on the roadway, and the other has to do with the content of in driver education courses, increasing the content in terms of interactions with other modes of transport. So
that's great.
Yeah, so all they need is to take a few of the parking spots over at the Secretary of State's
don't get
office
started.
and do some, do some practice
there you go.
of these people who are getting their licenses.
Absolutely.
thank you so much for coming and addressing it. It's very interesting.
Thank you.